Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series event at Damon College. I'm Bobby Mills, Senior Advisor to the President, and I have the impossible task of standing in for our President, Dr. Gary Olson, but I will try to be at least a worthy surrogate. He's hoping to be here a little bit later. As Secretary Card knows, as a former president of a college university, things come up all the time, and unfortunately, I drew the short straw, but actually it's an honor to be able to do this. We are truly honored to have with us today a leader who not only served his country with great distinction, but has served in one of the most important positions in recent history, White House Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. We are delighted to have him on campus to share his thoughts about the role of the White House Chief of Staff as President Donald Trump continues to face challenges of any first-term president. But before I introduce our Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series speaker, I want to recognize some very important guests who are with us today, and I also want to thank Carl Balmas and Brian Rusk for bringing this distinguished guest to our campus, and thank you very much. We know he has lots of other places he could be, and we're delighted that he's here with us. Thank you both very much. I appreciate that. First, I'm especially pleased to extend a special welcome to Reverend Kathleen Card. Reverend Card has an equally distinguished career as a leader within the United Methodist Church, as a former associate pastor at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas, and I understand a former English teacher. So our president was an English major, I was an English major. I don't know what that means, but we like English teachers and English majors. So let's give a warm Wildcat welcome to Reverend Kathleen Card. Next, I would be remiss if I did not thank the sponsors of the Damon's Distinguished Leader Lecture Series and one of the finest law firms in the state, Harris Beach. Brian Mahoney was going to be with us. I don't know if Brian made it yet, but we want to thank them for their continued sponsorship of this lecture series that's been a big success. We're also very pleased to recognize Gail Mitchell, who is one of our board members, and Don Hutton, another board member, who are esteemed members of the Board of Trustees of Damon College. Let's give them a big round of applause as well. We're also delighted to have with us, we've adopted him since he tells us that there's no college or university in his district. True. Assemblyman Robin Schimminger, we're delighted to have him here, and we're hoping that we have several other members from the Assembly that join us also. Thank you, Mr. Schimminger, for being here. Also with this afternoon, we have some of our distinguished town leaders in the region. Steve Sanders, Deputy Town Supervisor of the town of Amherst. Delighted to have him here, and hoping to be here soon is Jeff Raby, who is not only the superintendent of the Depew Union Free School District, he's a Damon graduate, so we're hoping he will make it as well. And then John Chamarney, from the president of the Lancaster Area Chamber of Commerce, will be joining us as well. It's also good to have on campus our friend Stanton Hudson, Executive Director of the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site in Buffalo. Good to see you again as well. Also, we're expecting Roger Woodworth, who does a great job as the head of the One Stop Veterans Center, does a great job for our veterans. Is Roger here? No, catch him later. And last, certainly but not least, I'm pleased to recognize several staff professionals who do such a great job serving our elected officials and us. I used to be a staffer in the Senate, so I always like to recognize staff when they're here. So we have Patrick Kennedy. Patrick? From the office of Monica Wallace, and we have Madeline Genovese, and Erica Lutz, and Robert Welsh from the office of State Senator Robert Ort. Let's give them a special welcome. The whisper heard around the world was delivered to President George W. Bush when the tragedy of September 11, 2001 unfolded in New York, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon near our nation's capital. And it was delivered to the President by our Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series speaker this afternoon, Secretary Andrew H. Card, Jr. Secretary Andrew Card embodies what public service is all about. After serving from 1975 to 1983 as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, Secretary Card joined the administration of President Ronald Reagan and served in various roles, including Deputy Assistant to the President, liaison to governors, state legislators, mayors, and other elected officials. From 1989 to 1992, Andrew Card served as Assistant to the President, Deputy Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush. From 1992 to 1993, he served as Secretary of Transportation in the President's Cabinet and helped to coordinate the President's disaster relief efforts in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew. He also directed the transition of President Bush to the administration of then-President-elect Bill Clinton. From 1993 to 1999, Secretary Card had an equally distinguished career in the private sector, serving as President and CEO of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association and Vice President of Government Relations at General Motors. On November 26, 2000, Secretary Card was appointed Chief of Staff to President-elect George W. Bush. He served as White House Chief of Staff to President Bush until April of 2006, making him the second longest tenured White House Chief of Staff in U.S. history. Must have an incredible amount of patience and perseverance. That's truly a great honor. And yes, during this time, he had the unenviable task of informing the President of the United States about the terrorist attacks on our country on September 11th. On July 5th, 2011, Secretary Card was named acting dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and in December of 2014, Andrew Card became the fifth president of Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire, where he would serve with distinction until his retirement from that post in the summer of last year. Mr. Card received his Bachelor's of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of South Carolina, and I showed off to him that I was wearing my South Carolina Gamecock tie today in honor of his presence here, so I want some real kudos for that one. I pulled it out of my closet. My daughter gave it to me for Christmas. He also received his honorary degree from the University of Massachusetts in 2007, and also attended the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He served proudly as a U.S. Merchant Marine from 1966 to 1967. In summary, with his term as a state representative and service to 3 presidents, Andy Card epitomizes the honor and value of public service. We are honored that he is with us today. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce our distinguished leader lecture speaker, Mr. Andrew H. Card, Jr. Thank you. Have some water for us.
Well, thank you, Bobby Mills. It's a great introduction. I am thrilled to be here at Damon College. I am just thrilled, and it's such a privilege to be able to meet you. And if I haven't literally shaken your hand, I hope I do before you run away. The person I was most anxious to meet, however, is Maureen. And her husband has been very good to me and helping me in a lot of things around the country. And I feel as if I've known Maureen for a long time, but today was the first time I met her. So Maureen, thank you, and thanks for what you do for Damon College. I am also very grateful for those of you who are here, our elected officials. It takes a lot of courage to have your name put on a ballot and stand before people and seek their support. I have great empathy and sympathy, but most of all, I have great respect, no matter what your partisanship or your philosophy, so thank you for what you do. I am a very blessed man, and the blessings started when I was born, believe it or not. That I still consider that a great blessing to be born, so all of you have had that blessing. And I met a wonderful woman when I was in the 5th grade who ended up deciding that she would spend the rest of her life with me, but it was not in the 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade. It was much later than that. But my wife, Kathleen, is here, and we met in Holbrook, Massachusetts, 15 miles south of Boston, and we just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. I am 70, do the math. She's only 50, so I married her when she was born. But I feel very privileged to be here. I am here to talk about the noble call of public service. And I'm doing it in the context of what it means to be a chief of staff to a president. You should understand that I grew up in a family that was blessed to recognize that being a public servant is an obligation, invitation, and an opportunity. My grandmother, my father's mother, who was an educator, was a militant suffragette fighting for women to get the right to vote. And hanging on the wall in her dining room at 39 Linfield Street in Holbrook, Massachusetts, was a picture of women wearing white dresses marching down Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, fighting for women to get the right to vote. She is in that picture. I'm not sure that I could pick her out, but she says she's in it. I think she was in it. But I do know this because I've confirmed it. She was the first woman to register to vote in our hometown of Holbrook, Massachusetts. And she registered to vote on the day that the 20th Amendment to the Constitution was added to the Constitution. And she went in, registered to vote as the first woman to register to vote in that town, but she also did something else that was very controversial. She filed to be a candidate for school committee. So I grew up in a family where there was an expectation that no matter what your calling in life, you had to pay attention to the responsibility to be part of a government. My grandmother used to say the most important word in the Constitution was the very first word, we. She said, when the word was put in the Constitution, it was not all-inclusive. Today it is. And my grandmother was the manifestation of that word becoming all-inclusive. So she said the Constitution was an unbelievable document. And we actually had to read it not just in school, but also at home. And she also encouraged all of us to participate in the political process. So sitting around the dining room table, before we could begin to eat our meal, we offered a blessing. But before we could pick up a utensil that would allow you to eat your meal, she had a charge for everyone at the table. And she'd look us right in the eye and say, "Tell me something from the newspaper today." The newspaper. And as a result, everyone who came to the table felt that they had to do homework before they got to the table. We scrambled to read the newspaper. And she let us say anything. I could talk about the Boston Red Sox or the Boston Celtics or the Boston Bruins. But inevitably, every conversation centered around public policy, politics, or what was going on Beacon Hill in Boston or on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. What a blessing to sit at a dining room table and be part of an argument that was welcomed, because my grandmother also did not expect us to agree. So she would challenge us if we said something. And she did not want monolithic thinking. And she said the government never benefits by monolithic thinking. There had to be a debate, and we had to do more homework to be prepared for the debate. So she would assign homework at that dining room table. But she also said that the Constitution is a great invitation. And if you read the Constitution, there is no obligation to any citizen if you read it. We're just citizens by birth, unless we're naturalized citizens. Are there any naturalized citizens in the audience? Well, every one of you should go to a naturalization ceremony to see what it means to become a citizen of this country. The rest of us are citizens because our mothers dropped us here. But my grandmother said, read the Constitution and you'll find that it's really an invitation. It's an invitation to be part of government. There is no obligation unless you accept the invitation. And she used to say, you better accept the invitation. We're not obligated to register to vote. We're invited to register to vote. and too few of us accept the invitation. I couldn't wait to be able to vote, to accept that invitation. We're not obligated to run for office. We're invited to run for office. I couldn't wait to run for office. I didn't realize that I graduated as an engineer from the University of South Carolina, and I wanted to be in politics. But I came to learn that if you're a politician and an engineer, you're an oxymoron. And I don't know whether I was the oxy or the moron, but I was both. And that's exactly as my grandmother would have it, because she said it doesn't make any difference what you're doing, except the invitation. And there are too few engineers in politics. But it's the invitation aspect that I want to talk about today. I am standing here because, well, do you remember the television show Cheers? It's about a bar in Boston. And the theme song to that show, which I loved that show, the theme song, "A Place Where Everybody Knows Your Name." I wanted to be the chief of staff where nobody knew my name. So I wanted to be just the opposite of that. And that's because I had had the privilege of serving in politics, serving in elective office, receiving an invitation to become the chief of staff to the President of the United States, and I had worked under every chief of staff scenario that served President George H.W. Bush, and before that, Ronald Reagan. And most of you don't remember these names, but there was a troika, Baker, Meese, Deaver, and then it was Jim Baker all alone, and then it was Don Regan, then it was Howard Baker, then it was Kenny Duberstein, then we changed presidents, and George H.W. Bush came in as president, and it was John Sununu, then it was Sam Skinner, and then it was Jim Baker again as chief of staff. I served under all of those chiefs of staff. So when the invitation came for me to be the chief of staff, I felt as if I had been prepared, because I watched the best and the brightest. And I learned good things from all of them, and I learned some bad things from all of them. But the one thing that I decided I would do would make sure it's not about me. Instead, I wanted to be the invisible chief of staff that kept the trains running on time, the president being well served. That invitation to serve as chief of staff was one I did not expect. In fact, please come to understand that. If you want to be chief of staff, never apply for the job. The president does not go to ZipRecruiter, doesn't go to Monster.com. You don't even know how he picks the chief of staff, but you don't apply for it. And when President George W. Bush, as president-elect, not quite, because it was after the election, but before the Supreme Court picked him, he asked me to be his chief of staff. And I thought he was asking me to be his head of transition into government. I had run the transition out of government, as Bobby mentioned. Turns out he was asking me to be his chief of staff, and he said, "I'm not talking about the transition thing, I'm talking about the big one." That was the term he used. I knew that he meant chief of staff. And that actually was on the Wednesday before the election. So when election night came and didn't go away, I knew that he was asking me to be his chief of staff. And what a privilege. The chief of staff's job, while there's been a lot of news about it lately, because of Reince Priebus and General John Kelly, you probably paid more attention to a chief of staff than you've paid in a very long time. I thought I would describe to you what the job of a chief of staff is. And it has nothing to do with Republican or Democrat politics, has nothing to do with philosophy, right wing, left wing, or no wing. I'm actually taking from a professor at Harvard. His name is Roger B. Porter, who wrote a book about White House organization, and he could write the book with credibility because he'd served at a lot of White Houses. And he said the job of a chief of staff is, number one, the care and feeding of the president. Number two, policy formulation. And number three, marketing and selling. And I came to recognize that that definition best suits the description of the job. So understand the responsibility is one that you don't ask for. You accept an invitation and you say yes. Number two, you've got to take care of the care and feeding of the president. That is by far the biggest part of the job and the most challenging. Number three, you get to do what everybody thinks a chief of staff does, and you argue about it at your dining room table, if you still sit at a dining room table, and you think that's policy, and you all have great solutions for policy. We all do, and we argue about it, and that's a big part of the chief of staff's job. And then the marketing and selling is, if the president makes a decision and nobody knows about it, did the president make a decision? Well, the truth is presidents should only make tough decisions, and chances are, when they make those tough decisions, they only tell the chief of staff what the answer is. So you have to figure out how to tell people about the decision. So that's the marketing and selling. And Roger Porter, I thought, was pretty accurate. So let me describe the care and feeding responsibility, the policy formulation responsibility, and the marketing and selling responsibility of a chief of staff. You should understand as well that the only bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. that is not created or controlled by Congress is the organization, bureaucracy called the White House. Congress appropriates the money and says how many people can have access to that money, but they don't say what the titles are or what the bureaucracy looks like. The president is allowed to form a bureaucracy to support him or her, and they don't even have to have a chief of staff. I think it's wise to have one. Some presidents did not, and they eventually found out they should have. But the president has the discretion to organize the White House any way the president wants to organize it. Thankfully, I was asked to help organize the bureaucracy. And that means that the first responsibility is to know the president, and for the president to know you. And it's best if you both understand each other's expectations of the job before it is accepted. So it starts off with President Bush asked, or George, he was then Governor Bush, asked me to be his chief of staff. I had to say to him, what are your expectations? And then I forced him to ask me, what are your expectations? And my expectations were pretty simple. You and I have to have an unbelievably candid relationship where I can say anything to you and you can say anything to me. You have to understand that if I'm going to be your chief of staff, I cannot be your friend. You're my friend, and I don't want to let you down. But as soon as I become your chief of staff, I cannot be your friend because I don't want you feeling bad about offending your friend. When I'm no longer chief of staff, I hope I'll be your friend. So we have to speak brutally candid to each other. And you have to allow me to organize a White House staff to suit your needs. Because you're asking me to be a staffer in charge of the staff, the chief. And if the staff doesn't think that they have to follow direction from the chief, I won't be a chief of staff. And he said, of course, that's what I want. I said, so if you're looking for a duet or a troika or a quartet or a quintet, you don't want me to be a chief of staff. But if you want me to be the chief of staff, I'd be honored to do it. But I have one other expectation. My wife has been my partner in everything I've done as an adult. If my wife doesn't feel part of what I am doing as your chief of staff, because it is a 24/7 obligation, I probably shouldn't do the job. I said, I'll never share the secrets with her, but I can't do the job without having permission to have her help me carry the burden. And he said, of course Kathleen can be partner in this thing. Of course, that's no problem. And I said, don't take this the wrong way, but you don't count that much. What does Laura say? And he said, let's go find out. And we get up out of our chairs, we walked into the kitchen, and he says, Laura, Andy says he'll be chief of staff if you can allow him to share the opportunity with his wife. And she says, Kathleen is always welcome. And she was always welcomed, which made it possible for me to do the job. So down to the responsibilities. Care and feeding, you have no clue the burdens in care and feeding for a president. But every one of you should want to be president. You're very well cared for. And there's a reason. Presidents have to make unbelievably tough decisions, and they don't get to pick the time that the decision is due. And it could be at midnight, or 4 o'clock in the morning, or on a Sunday morning at 3 a.m. And you don't ever want a president who's a pessimist. Can you imagine walking into the Oval Office, serving a president who says, I'm making the wrong decision today, but I'm going to make it. They've got to be an optimist. And since the decision's so tough, they have to know that it's not like everybody's going to agree with the decision you made. So I focused on the state of mind that the president was always in. Part of the care and feeding. I didn't want him worrying about how government would work because he had to make presidential decisions. So I didn't want him losing confidence in government because the teleprompter didn't work, or because his luggage got lost on Air Force One, or the rose garden didn't have roses planted in it, or that he couldn't find a tie to put on, or the limo didn't show up. So I paid attention to every aspect of his life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He never had to do the laundry as president. They would lay his ties and shirts out for him, so they always matched. He could have a meal almost any time he wanted it. Pretty good life. His bed was made for him. Great life. But the care and feeding is a big job. So scheduling, advance, dealing with the military, the Secret Service, making sure the logistics always work, the job of a chief of staff. Policy formulation, the one that you think you have all the answers to and you want to be part of. My job was to make sure the smart people that the president hires to work with him or her recognized they were hired because they probably have great tunnel vision and they're experts. And most of them are quite confident in their ability to advise a president. I mean, you don't earn a PhD or earn recognition as a policy expert without having confidence that you really know your topic. So I was never afraid that the president wouldn't get really good information. What I was afraid was that someone would be a bully in the process and deny other good information from coming in. So the policy formulation for a chief of staff to the president is really to make sure there is a process of policy development where no one bullies anyone else into a policy recommendation that doesn't include the recognition that it's the president's decision, not a staffer's decision. So I had to work with all of these very competent people with strong personalities, and most of them do have type A personalities. Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice. Really competent people, strong views. But my job was to make sure that they never allowed the playing field to be tilted their way to the exclusion of other information. And the other aspect of policy formulation and the process, you have a process less about the policy and more about the consequence to policy. So you have a very good process to allow lots of people with different views and different perspective to be part of the process so that you understand as many as possible consequences to the policy before you announce it. Because too frequently, if you don't have a process, your policy is defined more by the unintended consequences than it was the original expectation on policy. Witness Donald Trump in his first executive order on immigration. So the job of the chief of staff is really one of managing a process of policy rather than being the policy guru. Believe me, I was not the brightest member of the staff. But I could keep that playing field level so the president would get the best advice on a full range, and to the extent possible, have lots of discussions about the consequence. Because you don't want as many unintended consequences as come with an irrational policy process. And again, that final version, if the president makes a decision that's tough, and he tells the chief of staff, the marketing and selling is really hard. And it's hard inside the White House because you have to tell people that advise differently on the policy by definition because you don't want monolithic counsel in the White House. And somebody would say, oh, he's making a big mistake, I've got to go see him again. And I would tell the president that Sally has reservations, and he'd say, I thought about that, I don't need that. Those are hard conversations to have. That's marketing and selling. Communicating with Congress is always a challenge because they're vampires. They don't do real work until the sun has gone down. And it used to be great when the vampires had a conscience. And we really miss Tom Reynolds being in Congress with a conscience. Never mind communicating with the United Nations, or kings, queens, prime ministers, potentates, popes. That's all the communication challenge that a chief of staff has. Yes, it also includes the we in the Constitution. How do you communicate to the we, the people whose government it is? So that's the job of a chief of staff. So my goal was to be under the radar screen, highlighting Condi Rice, highlighting Vice President Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld, the members of the cabinet. I'd been a Secretary of Transportation, and I wanted to make sure the Secretary of Transportation felt pretty important. Who is the Chief of Staff? I knew Washington would know it, but I didn't expect the world to know it. I kind of wanted my hometown to know it. They did. But I really wanted to be, who is that guy? It's working. September 11th, 2001. Bobby, thank you for mentioning that because it was a day that changed the world. Well, can I tell you about the day? And then I'll take questions. Number one, it was a gorgeous day in America. September 11th, 2001. There was literally not a cloud in the sky in the entire lower 48. It was a beautiful day. And the president woke up in Sarasota, Florida, at a resort, a golf and tennis resort. And we had arrived the night before after a long day of activity in Washington, D.C., and Jacksonville, Florida, and then in Sarasota. And when we arrived at this resort, I remember the doors to the Secret Service limousines opened up and we jumped out. Oh, there was this terrible stench in the air. The red tide had killed a lot of fish. They'd washed up on the beach, and it stunk. But we went into the hotel and dropped our luggage off, went back out and piled into limousines, and a very small number of us got to go to dinner with the president, where he was having a fun dinner with his brother, the governor of Florida, and some of his friends from the Tampa-St. Pete area, and it was not work for him. Something very rare for a president to do, to have actually dinner that he enjoys. And he stayed out late, something that President George W. Bush did not do very often, and usually didn't want to, but he enjoyed the conversation. So we came back to the hotel, and we were probably about 30 minutes later than anyone had expected. And he was feeling pretty good. And he went to bed, and the next morning I woke up really early. Chiefs of staff have to get up really early. And I went downstairs and checked on the advance team to make sure the limousines were all lined up the right way, that the advance team had gone over to the school, and this is 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I remember telling the advance team, you got to move the motorcade around, and just kind of logistics problems. Then I went and met with the CIA representative who was getting ready to brief the president. He'd been up already hours getting a report ready for the president, and he said he was ready. And then I tracked down the president's doctor, because I knew the president was planning to go for a run on a golf course. And with the terrible stench in the air, which was still there when I went out and checked in the morning, I said, is the president going to get sick if he exerts himself out in the golf course running in this terrible stench? And the doctor says to me, no, he'll be fine. And then I went in to see the president, and he was up, getting dressed in his running clothes. He was preoccupied with this run in the golf course, which I was a little surprised at. And that's because he invited a reporter to go running with him. His name is Stretch Kyle. And he found out after he gave the invitation to go running that Stretch Kyle had been an NCAA All-American cross-country runner. And I don't know if you know the Bushes, and by the way, they've both been to this area quite a bit. They're very competitive. They don't let their grandkids win at checkers. They're very competitive. And George W. Bush was really worried that he had invited Stretch Kyle to go running, and he was probably going to lose the race. So that's what he was talking about. And I said, well, go have a great run. When you come back, we'll do the CIA briefing, and it should be an easy day because you're talking about your very favorite topic, leaving no child behind in education. And he's great. And as he's walking out the door, I said, oh, by the way, Mr. President, I checked with the doctor, and he said, don't worry about the red tide stench. You shouldn't get sick. And all he did was look at me like, you are an idiot. I got that look a few times. He went out for the run, and I was doing all my work. He comes back into the room, and he has got the George Bush strut. He is feeling pretty full of himself because he beat Stretch Kyle. And he ran 7.5-minute miles for 3 miles. He was just feeling pretty good. And he starts to get undressed and goes in, takes his shower, and then we sit down and we have the CIA briefing. And I don't remember that being particularly memorable. When it ended, we piled into limousines to head over to the Emmer E. Booker Elementary School. And as we're getting into the limousines, I did hear two people raise a question. Anybody hear about a plane crash in New York City? One was Karl Rove, the other was Dan Bartlett. Karl Rove is well known. Dan Bartlett was the acting communications director on the trip. We rode over to the Emma E. Booker School. We arrived at a classroom that had been converted into a White House command center. Secure telephones, computers, a staff. And the president, when we arrived into the command center, pick up the phone and call Dr. Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor. She was back in Washington, D.C. I didn't hear that conversation because I went into the classroom where the president was going to go to see if it was set up the right way. And I saw the second graders all lined up, getting ready to come into the room, and they were excited. The press pool was beginning to gather with Ari Fleischer, the press secretary. They hadn't entered the room yet, but I could see them in the hall. They were getting all together. And I checked the room out and actually saw a misspelled word on one of the bulletin boards. I said, get a book cover to cover that up. I didn't want a potato moment. And then I walked back into the holding room. And I opened the door to go into the holding room, and I'm standing with the president and the principal of the school. And the principal is getting ready to escort the president into the classroom, when a Navy captain by the name of Deb Lauer, who went on to become an admiral, and she was the acting national security advisor on the trip. She was the director of the White House Situation Room. She came up to the president and said, "Sir, it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City." The president, the principal, and I all had exactly the same reaction. Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. And then the principal opened the door to the classroom, and she and the president walked into the classroom. The door shut, and Captain Lauer came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner." My mind flashed to the fear that the passengers on that plane must have had. They had to know it wasn't gaining altitude. That's where my mind went. I don't know why. But that was only a nanosecond, because Captain Lauer came back up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center." My mind then flashed to three initials, UBL, Osama bin Laden. I knew about Al-Qaeda. I knew about the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1992. I then performed a test that chiefs of staff have to perform all the time, many times during the course of a day. And it's usually a tough test. Does the president need to know? This was an easy test to pass. Yes, the president needs to know. And I thought about what I would say. I didn't take a long time to do it, but I knew the president was sitting in front of second graders, in front of a press pool. There was probably a boom microphone over his head. And I knew that I would be coming in behind him from backstage. So I made a decision to pass on two facts, make one editorial comment, and do nothing to invite a dialogue with the president. I didn't want him asking me a question. I thought about the words I would use, and I did it pretty efficiently and very quickly. And I opened the door to the classroom, and as I stepped into the room, I could tell the teacher sitting in front of those second graders was conducting a dialogue between the students and the president. Say good morning to the president. Good morning, Mr. President. And there's this dialogue going back and forth. I did not want to interrupt that dialogue. Ann Compton from ABC News was in the press pool. And she looks up at me, and it was unusual for me to enter the room after the president had gone in. It was certainly unusual to enter from backstage. And she said, "What's up?" And I said, "2 planes." And she said, "What?" And then the teacher told the students, to take out their books because they were going to read with the president. It was when I saw the students reaching down to take their books out that I walked up to the president and leaned over and whispered into his right ear. And he didn't see me coming. He didn't hear me coming. I said to him, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. 2 facts, 1 obvious editorial comment. The president did not turn around, but I could see his head bobbing up and down. And I stepped back from him so that he couldn't ask me a question. I took about 3 steps back and just paused. When he didn't turn around or get up, I went back to the door of the classroom and looked at him again, and I could see his head was still bobbing up and down. The students were oblivious and very excited with their books opening on their desks. The press pool had turned and was now focusing on Ari Fleischer. And in my left peripheral vision, I saw Secretary of Education Rod Page, a White House staffer on education named Sandy Kress, and the principal of the school huddled, kind of mouthing, "What's going on? What's going on?" And I opened the door and walked back into that holding room. I was very pleased with how the president reacted because he did nothing to introduce fear to those very young students. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. But I was also pleased that he allowed me to do work before he came into that holding room. So the first thing I said is, get the FBI director on the phone. Bob Mueller had only been the FBI director for 10 days. Number 2, I said, get a line open to the vice president, get a line open to the White House Situation Room. To the crew of Air Force One, get back on the plane. We're going to have to leave. They weren't planning to leave for hours. To the Secret Service, I said, turn the motorcade around, get ready to depart. We'll be getting ready to depart. To Dan Bartlett and the communication team, I said, get some remarks written for the president. We have 600 people in a gymnasium. He will have to say something to them, but we can't say anything that we don't know to be the truth. Then the door from the classroom opens up and the president steps into the holding room. The first thing he does after everybody kind of gloms onto him, which is always it happens, Mr. President, Mr. President, he said, get the FBI director on the phone. We could say, he's right here, Mr. President. He talked to the FBI director, he talked to the vice president, talked to the national security team. He called Governor Pataki. Then he sat down and worked on his remarks. And I went into the room where he was going to be talking to the people that had gathered. I came in from behind the audience just to see if it was set up the right way. And I saw the room filled, and they were all excited that the president was going to come out. And then the president came out with the Secretary of Education, Rod Page, and the principal of the school. And the crowd stood, and the president asked everybody to sit down. And then he opened his mouth and started to deliver very short remarks about what had happened. I cringed because he said something at the beginning that I knew probably wasn't the truth. He said, we're going back to Washington. And he told people what had happened. Everything else he said was 100% true. But he said he was going back to Washington. And I didn't know that, in fact, we were. We went out, and I sat with the president in his limousine, and we're both on our phones calling back to Washington, D.C. And he's frustrated that he couldn't reach Secretary Rumsfeld. Why? Because the Pentagon had just been hit. And Secretary Rumsfeld was out helping with the search and recovery efforts at the Pentagon. We stepped out of the limousine as it arrived at the base right near Sarasota, and I was struck that there was a violation. They opened the doors to the limousine. I stepped out, and you heard the roar of jet engines. Air Force One had already cranked the engines up. Normally, the engines don't start till the president is safely on the plane. And I'm thinking, the pilot must know something. We run up the gangplank and get on the plane. As soon as the president gets in, the doors shut. And before the president has even gone into his seat, the plane starts rumbling down the runway. And we take off at a very steep altitude. I learned later because they were fearful that they may be Stinger missiles watching that runway. And we flew up to 48,000 feet, which is very high. And we started flying in this serpentine way back and forth, waiting for fighter jets to catch up with us, to protect us. And the pilot for Air Force One, Mark Tillman, is asking, "Where are we going?" And I'm meeting with military aides on the plane, and there were two, which is unusual on this trip, and they were phenomenally helpful. I said, "Give me lots of options. I need a long runway, a very secure place, one with good communications." And they gave me some options, and the best option was Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. And what was fortunate was they were already on an alert. Had nothing to do with what was happening on 9/11. They were just on a practice alert at the highest level. They were on alert for a nuclear attack as part of an exercise. Perfect. We're going to Barksdale Air Force Base. Don't tell anyone. Talk to the pilot. He says, "Perfect, that's where we're going." We fly to Barksdale Air Force Base, and on the way there, the president is saying, "We're going back to Washington, D.C." I said, "Mr. President, I don't think you want to make that decision right now. It's a premature decision. Secret Service does not recommend it. The pilot of Air Force One does not recommend it." He says, No. We are going back to Washington, D.C." "Mr. President, I don't think you want to make that decision right now. We have to learn a lot more." "We are going back to Washington, D.C., and I'm telling you right now, we're going back to Washington, D.C. Eventually, we'll get to Washington, D.C., but right now, you don't want to make that decision." It ended up being a very heated argument. Very, very heated. The Secret Service was right there. They agreed with me, didn't say a word to him. That's when I realized they weren't there to protect him. They were not there to protect me. Bottom line is we landed at Barksdale Air Force Base, and we trimmed down the number of people on Air Force One. And the big debate was, do you allow a pool of press to go with you to the next stop, which I had already decided would be the Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska. And Ari Fleischer did a wonderful job of advocating for a press pool to be with us, and we decided to let that happen. But we took a skeleton crew on Air Force One of staffers and a trimmed-down press pool, and we flew the Strategic Air Command, the SAC Command in Omaha, Nebraska. When we landed there, we got out of the plane, got quickly into limos and Suburbans and Humvees, and drove very quickly to a bunker, an underground bunker, went deep down under the surface of the earth, and it was right out of the movies, all these flat screen TVs, all these admirals and generals there. You could hear all of the communication from planes and the FAA and the military. And you know, generals and admirals are taught to stand when the president walks into the room. So they all stand up, but they're still working, and it was kind of like really awkward. And the fog of war was something you could hear. Maybe you didn't see it, but you could hear it, because the information coming over the radio was, "There's a plane coming in from Madrid and it's not identifying itself." "Oh, that's right, it's not coming in from Madrid," and it did identify itself. But you hear all of these communications. The president realized his presence is disrupting the work of the admirals and generals. So he says, "Let's go to another room." We go to another room where we have a secure video conference back to Washington, D.C. with the national security team. It was a very, very serious and sobering meeting. The president turns to me at the end of the meeting and he says, "Can we go back to Washington, D.C. now?" And I said, "Let me check." So I go out and check with the Secret Service, check with the Air Force, and tell the president we can go back to Washington, D.C. As we're flying back to Washington, D.C., watching on television, we could see the towers pancake. Everybody on the plane was crying. There were lots of prayers. There wasn't much conversation. We'd already witnessed what had happened when Flight 93 crashed into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, thanks to the first heroes in the War on Terror, who are all civilians, that said, "Let's roll." As we're coming into land at Andrews Air Force Base, the fighter jets that were protecting Air Force One were so close to us that we could actually see the faces of the pilots. We land, get off Air Force One, and get on Marine One, the helicopter. And we lift off, and normally Marine One lifts off pretty high off the ground at Andrews and heads right straight for the Washington Monument, takes a left and lands on the south lawn at the White House. This day we lifted off, but we flew at treetop level in a zigzag pattern, making it hard for any Stinger missiles to find us. Got down to the Potomac River, hugged the river, flew up the river, popped up to come over the Lincoln Memorial, fly up to the Washington Monument, and take a left and land on the south grounds of the White House. The president gets off the helicopter, and by the way, on the helicopter ride there, we could see the smoke billowing from the Pentagon. And the president turned to me and said, "That's the face of war in the 21st century." We land on the south ground, and the president gets off the helicopter, and he doesn't go into the residence. He goes into the Oval Office. And the rug has been rolled up, and Klieg lights have been installed. They're getting ready for the president to make an address to the American people in the world. We go into a dining room just off the Oval Office, and the president sits down to work on his speech that had been prepared by Mike Gerson and Karen Hughes. He makes some changes. He practices it a couple times. Then he says he's ready. Walks into the Oval Office, and he gives a stark reality speech to the American people. Go back and listen to it. After that speech, we all go down to the bunker underneath the White House in the President's Emergency Operations Center. And we have a National Security Council meeting. When the meeting ends, the President and Laura Bush go up to the residence. I go back to my office. By this time, it's 10:30 at night, 11 o'clock at night. And I'm sitting at my desk with all the paperwork. I'm trying to go through it and pack it up to take it home with me. When running into my office come two Secret Service agents. And they literally pick me up and start running with me. And we run down the corridor. And then we go down to the bunker under the White House. And I get in, and the great big door pulls shut. And President Bush and Laura Bush walk in. They're both wearing robes, very silly looking slippers. They're carrying pets. Laura doesn't have her contacts in. And they go to a room with a nice bed in it. I get assigned a nice steel cot. And then the Secret Service comes in and says, it's all clear. A plane was entering the airspace of Washington, D.C. and hadn't identified itself. Turns out it's one of ours. They just had the transponder turned off. You can go back to bed, Mr. President. He goes back up to bed. Laura Bush goes back up to bed. I go home. I had not talked to my wife the entire day. She's a minister. Her church in McLean, Virginia, was right near the CIA. And they had opened it up for people to come and worship. And lots of people from the CIA came. But I hadn't talked to my wife, and I felt very guilty that I hadn't even checked in with her. I told her about the day, and it was very, very late, like 1 o'clock in the morning. At 4:08, I woke up. Why? Because I always woke up at 4:08. Since my wife is a minister, Philippians 4:8 says, think of that which is honorable and just and good. Think of those things. So we wake up at 4:08. As my friends say, there are other Bible verses that start with 6. But since I had to be to work at the White House between 5:30 and 5:45 in the morning, 4:08 was a good time to get up. And I went into work the next day, and I can tell you, I was so impressed with the President of the United States. I am convinced that on September 11th, 2001, when I whispered into his ear in that classroom, was the day that he became president. Because I think that he focused on that Constitution that I started with, the one that begins with the word we. The shortest article in the Constitution, the original articles, happens to be Article 2. It's the only provision in the Constitution that is personified by one person, the President of the United States. He is the executive branch of government. We all know other people that think they are. They're important. Read the Constitution. The President is the executive branch of government. But also in Article 2 is written the shortest oath of office taken by anyone who serves in government. It's shorter than the one that members of Congress take or members of the planning board in Amherst or the school committee. It calls for the President to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That's the job. And I honestly believe that George W. Bush, sitting in that classroom, thought about his job as president. And if you notice in our Constitution, there isn't one oath that has a conditional clause in it. If. Doesn't say if it's easy, if everybody agrees. No. You've got to do it. It doesn't even say if Congress gives you permission. You've just got to do it. So that's the burden. So with that, I've overstayed my welcome. It's now 4:35, and I think you were promised to be out of here a long time ago. We promised never to forget 9/11. I suspect you all promised that. Almost 3,000 people died that day. Over 400 of them, almost 500 of them, 496 to be exact, were firefighters, Port Authority policemen, or EMTs. They answered a call to duty and didn't come back from it. Far too many of them were truly innocent Americans that just boarded a plane in Boston to go to Los Angeles. An awful lot of them just went to work. And some of them had unbelievable obligations. And I don't know if you've ever listened to some of the phone calls that were made from the towers. Someone from my hometown was in the towers and called his wife and said, I love you. I'm sorry you couldn't be there to answer the phone. I want you to know how much I love you, and I love our children. I don't think I can take it anymore. The heat is getting too much. But I love you. And he jumped. There were heroes. I talked about Flight 93. Beamer. Let's roll. They're heroes right at the World Trade Centers. One retired security officer ran up and down the flights of stairs at the World Trade Center some 27 times. Brought 2,700 people out. And he died and his body was never found. So don't forget the day. Remember the victims. Remember the heroes, those who made sacrifices to save others, and those who just showed up to help and didn't die, but carry a burden because they did show up to help. So I don't feel guilty about taking your time to tell you the story. And remember, being president is really important. And because the people who serve in the military or in the clandestine services, today, every one of them is a volunteer. No one is drafted. They answered that invitation that my grandmother talked about and joined the military. And you know that there are 2 oaths that you take if you're in the military? The first one is a pretty common oath: protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. There's a second oath they take. And it's a longer oath. It's a very long oath. And it calls for them to follow the command of the commander-in-chief. And there is no conditional clause to it. If I voted for him, if I agree with him, if the French give me permission, no. Follow the command of the commander-in-chief. That puts a burden on a president. Most of you never think about that. I witnessed that burden. It's a burden that never goes away, even when they leave office. If there are people who followed their command and made sacrifices that they would never invite on anybody, the president carries the burden. So respect our president, even if you didn't vote for him, even if you don't like him, even if you don't agree with him. Respect the burden that they carry, and respect those who carry the burden of helping the president do the job that is necessary to be done. Thank you, God bless you, and I'll take some questions, but I'm sure I overstayed my welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen. Takes a lot to make me speechless, but I am. Some questions for the Secretary? Gene.
Don't be bashful. I do know my Constitution. I can always plead the Fifth.
My question has to do with your relationship with the communications and public relations staff that are in there, so that when you talk about the policy that you set, that it was your responsibility to then explain a decision that the president made. So talk about a little bit about how you worked with the
Communications staff?
Yeah, did you
Sure.
tell them what to do, or was it a back and forth, or?
First of all, it's terribly important that most people at the White House do the job they were hired to do. That means have great tunnel vision. Okay? There are a few people who are obligated to do their job with the benefit of peripheral vision. I think a chief of staff's job is to understand the context of a decision. So I worked really hard to have an understanding of what was happening peripherally while all these tunnel vision people were making their decisions. press secretaries or people in communications have the responsibility to pay attention to the peripheral expectations as well as understand the decisions inside the White House. I would regularly seek the counsel of the people in the communication staff about the challenge of communicating something that had to be communicated, but it was out of context to what the people came to understand. It's a tricky balance. And the First Amendment to the Constitution is the one that gives the press the right to cover the White House and everybody else. And there's no definition of the word press. If you read the Constitution, there's no definition of it. So it's not like necessarily people earn a credential. Some people self-proclaim a credential. So it's challenging, and the constituency of the press is very malleable. So that is a challenge for a press secretary. And I think one of the toughest jobs at the White House is being the president's press secretary. My favorite press secretary was Marlin Fitzwater, who served for two President Reagan and the first President Bush. And the one thing that I'd say is critical for the press is to never be fed information that we know to be false. So judgment ethics are very important for a press secretary to have. The other thing that any press secretary has to have the ability, the same way a chief of staff does, you have to enjoy a meal of crow every once in a while. Where, oh, I screwed up. I'm sorry, Mr. President, you can fire me. But I was very attentive to the people who worked at the White House and why they were hired. So I never tried to do anybody else's job for them. They were hired to do a job, so I was very deferential to their responsibility to do the job. For example, I wouldn't go lobby on Capitol Hill without the legislative affairs folks telling me whether or not I should go. Same thing about the press. You didn't find me a lot in the press. The press I did when I was chief of staff was because the press secretary or the communications team asked me to do it. But I was very involved in the messages that they had to deliver, when to deliver it, and how to deliver it. So it's a challenge. I'm not sure I have a good answer to you saying, first of all, in the White House, because it's so much smaller than it looked like on the television show The West Wing. I mean, these are small little offices. The real estate is unbelievably valuable and everybody wants it. And you find people that want to squat in an office and take it over. So that's all normal. But because it is such an intimate setting, there is lots of opportunity for personalities to be in conflict. And I found the best way to prevent the conflicts from damaging the ability of the president to get good advice and counsel was having really good communications inside the White House, so among the staff. So I worked really hard to make sure everybody's voice was welcomed, but use, number one, your indoor voice, not your outside voice. Number two, voice with respect. And number three, don't husband your knowledge to the exclusion of somebody else. Knowledge is power, and if people husband their knowledge to maximize their power, they are not serving the president well. So I was very open about communications inside the White House. Let's get it on our table before you take it to somebody else's table. So that was just how I practiced the job. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes?
You say that a press secretary should never give false information. Historically, we have seen that press secretaries and presidents have given very gravely false information. For instance, President Johnson, President Nixon.
Yeah, you've been watching the Vietnam War.
Yes, that was on
Ken-
the Vietnam War series
Yep.
on public television recently. Both of these presidents gave false information.
I want to be careful. I don't think the press secretary should knowingly give false information. If the president is not truthful with the press secretary, I don't fault the press secretary for saying what the president said to say. So it's a tricky balance. Now, if the press secretary knows that it's false, I would hope the press secretary would say to the president, Mr. President, I cannot say that. In good conscience, I cannot say that. So I will not say that. Maybe you want somebody else to say it if you think it's important to be said. So I'm going to back off a little bit. I don't know whether the press secretary to Richard Nixon or Lyndon Baines Johnson knew information was false when they gave it. So I just don't know that. I know that Marlon Fitzwater was particularly astute at saying that, telling the president as a condition for doing the job, I cannot do the job if I misrepresent the truth, what I know to be true. So don't lie to me, or don't let me be in a position where I would lie and you don't know about it. Now, but presidents also don't have to make all of their decisions in front of a committee. So I'm going to defend a president and a press secretary, but I think press secretaries in particular should be very careful about the words they use. My simple words that I would give anybody who wants to be president, anybody who is president, or anybody who works in the White House, because words mean so much in the White House. Taste your words before you spit them out. If you are impulsive with your words, impulsive things will happen in government. So taste your words before you spit them out. It's very difficult to have that discipline in the digital era. But, yes.
Maybe two more questions.
I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great.
Yes. It's kind of a follow-up to this. And, I mean, it is well known, I mean, regardless of what anyone's personal views are in this room, that our current president, I don't think there has been a president, at least in recent memory, whose competence and temperament have come so under challenge. And
I will say, I understand where you're headed.
yeah,
Donald Trump is our president. Okay. So I did not vote for him, so I don't want to mislead you. I didn't vote for him. I campaigned very vigorously for Jeb Bush because I thought he would have been the best Republican nominee. So I accept that. But I also respect he won. And he won consistent with the rules.
right.
So he's our president. I don't want him to fail. So I'm always looking for the 2x4 of discipline to hit him.
Well, that's my question. How do you do that?
I'm grateful that, presidents decide who should be on their staff. I don't want to get in the way of doing that. I don't think there should be a confirmation process for someone who works on the president's immediate staff. So even though I would have said he shouldn't have done this or not done that, I think he has the right to do what he did, and he did it. So he's got a staff around him. I pray that everybody in the staff tastes their words before they spit them out, even to the president. But I would also like to see them have the courage to speak truth to power. I think that's critically important. Getting a job at the White House is like a really big deal. I mean, it is beyond. I never dreamed I would work at the White House for 3 presidents. I never thought I'd visit the White House for 1 president. It was just like unbelievable. And you get this document called the Commission, and it is a beautiful document. It says United States of America. Then in beautiful calligraphy, it's got your name, Andrew H. Carr Jr., and it says your state of Massachusetts, which is a lot of calligraphy to go into the word Massachusetts. And then it says what your title is, Assistant to the President and Chief of Staff, and you feel really full of yourself. And the President says, you serve at the pleasure of the President for the time being. It's redundant in its insecurity. Because if the pleasure goes, you're gone. If the time being arrives, you're out the door. And you don't think about that when you get the fancy document. But it's funny, the word pleasure is such a seductive word. If you take the job and you work to please the president, you are not doing your job. Pleasure is a one-way street. So I would say if you work on the White House staff and you want that fancy piece of paper, Be comfortable in your insecurity. So if the pleasure disappears or the time arrives, say, thank you very much for yesterday. It was great. But do not play Mr. Suck-Up or Madam Suck-Up and try to please the president. Give the president unvarnished counsel on no matter what your discipline is. Serve ethics first, your oath second. I say second because most of us have a bigger conscience than any law, regulation, or oath. If your conscience is bothering you, chances are you probably crossed a line or you thought about it. So I used to tell everybody, pay attention to that little thing in your head called conscience. Second thing, your oath was not to the president. Your oath was to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's your job. That's the oath. You do not pledge loyalty to a president. You pledge loyalty to the country. Give the president your unvarnished, candid counsel. Don't give it to anyone else to the detriment of the president's ability to adjust with it. Keep it inside the family. So that's what I would say. But look, President Trump, he's the first president, I believe this is not hyperbole, I think he's the first president who truly had never had responsibility to govern.
That's right.
He was a CEO of a family-owned business. He didn't even have a real board of directors. So he was used to having the ability to make a decision and have it be the decision. You all know, as a legislator, that in governing, it's all about inviting people to be partners in a solution. You have to invite a bureaucracy to do the job the way you expected it. Now, he has some control to fire people in the bureaucracy, but he can't fire everybody. So invite them to be part of the solution. You got to invite Congress to be part of the solution. You got to invite the UN to be part of the solution, and so forth. So leading in a governing environment is very different than leading in a dictator's environment. And the CEO of a privately held company is a dictator's environment. So he never had the benefit of learning that. So he's on a learning curve. It's kind of awkward to go on the learning curve ride with him, but it is his curve. And I want the curve to be such that he understands as he progresses what he needs to do. I actually think he's getting there. I'm thrilled with General John Kelly coming in as Chief of Staff. I don't know him well, but I do know him, and I know him a little bit personally, a lot by reputation. And he's not just a general who leads in a tactical way. He was a general who led in a strategic way. He also worked on Capitol Hill as a liaison from the Defense Department to Capitol Hill, so he understands politics. He grew up in Massachusetts. I actually went to the same undergraduate school my wife did, UMass Boston. So, and she was in the same class with him. She didn't know him, and he didn't know her. But at any rate, I'm thrilled that he is bringing discipline into the White House. And there's been a dramatic change in the discipline of the structure of the White House, and that's critically important. I wish that tweets had never been invented, and I wish there could be more discipline imposed on the president, but unfortunately you don't have the ability to impose anything on a president like that. What you do is invite the president to recognize the consequence of untasted words or thumb misdirected tweets. And have any of you heard, one of the most powerful positions in the White House has the worst title to it. Assistant to the President and Staff Secretary. Nobody wants to be the Staff Secretary. It's like an unbelievably important job. That job is legally responsible for every document that goes in or out of the Oval Office. It's the final stop for documents on their way to the Oval Office before they get to the Oval Office. They are responsible for reading those documents. They are responsible for making sure that no one is being a bully in writing the document and putting something in there that hasn't been vetted with people that should have been vetted with. So it's a policing mechanism for policy. normally, in a normal presidency, nothing the president would say would show up on a script that hadn't gone through the staff secretary's hands. Tweets don't follow that rule. I wish that the tweets that the president put out, and I don't fault him for doing it, but I wish the tweets that he had sent out first went to the staff secretary. And the staff secretary could then cause others to step back and say, okay, let's look at this with peripheral vision. What are the consequences of this? Is it the right thing to do? Mr. President, I know you said this. Is there a better way to say it? Is it better not to say it at all? They don't have that discipline. And I don't know how we do. My favorite founding father was probably not the founding father that you would identify in New York, but it was John Adams. John Adams did a great job. He helped write the Massachusetts Constitution, which is the oldest living constitution in the world right now. Massachusetts Constitution in the democracy. The constitutions, our national constitution, came years later. And John Adams, in between our national constitution and the Massachusetts Constitution, was written a letter by the colony of North Carolina. It said, hey, what you did in Massachusetts is kind of cool. Could you give us advice on how to have a government? So he wrote a beautiful document called Thoughts on Government. And he sent it back to North Carolina. I think what John Adams wrote about in that document, first of all, he did his homework. He was an unbelievably good student, so Plato and Aristotle and going back to the founding of democracy and all this kind of stuff. He did his work, and it's reflected in this document. He said, look it, we need to have a government that is very close to the people. But it can't be so close to the people that the government makes emotional decisions. So it's got to be a republic form, representative. There are representatives of the people, and they should be quite close to the people. But you want them far enough away from the people that they exercise judgment rather than emotion. And then, since judgment alone isn't as good as you can do, you need to have another branch, also in the legislature, that is a step removed from the people, an upper branch, if you will, and they get to exercise wisdom and judgment. Because the greatest threat to a democracy is mob rule. Do not have mob rule. And then he says, and by the way, the government actually has to work, and you need an executive. Don't ever trust the executive, but you need him. So make sure the executive is really insecure, and hold them accountable, but don't let them stay in office too long. And then finally, you can't trust anybody. So have a court that is separate from the legislative branch or the executive branch, that's completely independent, and they'll take a look at things. That's a pretty remarkable document. And it was unbelievably controversial when John Adams wrote it. Because the only other document that was like that was the Massachusetts Constitution. So it was very, very controversial. What happened as a result of the changing demographics of the world and the media of the world, and I'm not talking about the media as in personalities, I'm talking about how we get our information, has changed dramatically. First, it used to go through AP, UPI, Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, whatever, you know, and then it was ABC, NBC, CBS. Walter Cronkite would come on very knowledgeably and tell us what was happening in the world. And we would get our news. We all got our news that way. And then we would form an opinion after the news came out. Then we'd argue about it. Well, I started working at the White House in 1983. And I remember a dramatic change when cable television showed up and radio talk show showed up. And the discipline in journalism, are there any journalist majors here? Anyway, in journalism, it used to be, you had to learn how to write, be objective in your writing, and how to accept the critique of an editor who would hold you accountable. Do you have two sources? If you only have one source, we can't run it. Two sources, otherwise we can't run it. And the editor played a huge role in that. Cable news shows up during the Reagan administration, and they're covering news all day long, and people got really bored because it was the same old news all day long, and they said, we can no longer live by that rule. So we're going to authorize, this was an honest thing that was done, we're going to go with a story if we get one source. We're not going to play the rule, two sources, we're going to run a story if we get one source. And that was a dramatic change for the journalism. And so they had one source. And then people would comment and they'd get other sources that were talking about the one source, so that became a story. Alert! So we all paid attention to cable news and said, alert! And if you watch cable news right now, there's an alert every 30 seconds. I can't turn the TV off because there's been another alert. So you watch that. Well, keep going down the line, you get to the digital world, and I am convinced, I love to give speeches to large audiences. I say, how many of you watch MSNBC in the morning? How many of you watch Fox News in the morning? I know which audience I'm speaking to. And now, the truth is, because we are so close to information, I'm not going to call it news, and I'm not going to call it fake news. I'm just going to call it information. We're so close to information that we claim our news to be that which we have a bias toward to begin with. Chances are you wake up in the morning and you either go to your computer and go to some website or blog or something like that, or you turn on Fox News or MSNBC, and you say, I knew I was smart because they agree with me. I was so smart when I woke up this morning, and I'm stuck on this, I'm doing it. And then it got even worse because the people in government said, guess what? I have direct access to you now, and you have direct access to me. It used to be, you thought you had direct access, but that was a phone call that went to a staffer, that went to somebody else, or the direct access came while you were in Washington, D.C., and you were getting ready for a town meeting, and they went to the town meeting and talked to you about it. Well, now, emails, text messages, and you want to be close to your constituency, so you're unbelievably attentive to the tweet that you get or the email that you get. And wow, you are one empathetic legislator. No, it's not sympathetic. You're empathetic. I feel your pain. That pothole is a terrible pothole, and I'm going to make sure it's filled. And you answer back, and you get these tweets. They come in all during the day, and they're on lots of different issues. I agree with you. I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm working on this one. And then you find out later on, oh, it wasn't quite what they said. I kind of wished I hadn't sent the tweet back saying I agree with you. But the last thing I want to do is be called a flip-flopper. So I'm going to agree with them, and I'll just eat my meal of crow later on, but right now I'm with you. What that has done, it's brought the mob closer to government. And emotion ends up ruling more than judgment. And wisdom is forgotten. So that's my fear. It was a very long answer to your question. But
That's great, thank you.
That's exactly, so I am a traditionalist. I'm even better than Neil Gorsuch. I actually believe that our Constitution was written with protections from the mob, and that we should hold legislators accountable for exercising judgment, and we should invite the Senate to bring wisdom with judgment and help build some buffer between the emotions and the right answer. And I don't know how to do it, but that's what I would be spending all my time, if I had my druthers, helping to invite people to find the right way to respect the need for judgment and reduce the motivations of the mob. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Well, we can't let you go quite yet. Damon College has had many important distinguished members of our growing family of Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series speakers. And now you're a member of that family, whether you like it or not.
I won't be invited back again because I took too long.
On behalf of the college, I did not want you to leave campus without receiving at least an additional recognition of our appreciation for your service to 3 presidents and most importantly to our country. Your impressive career clearly demonstrates and reinforces that public service is an honorable calling, and your service to President George W. Bush, including service at perhaps the most important date in modern history, September 2001. In addition, you served with great distinction during the period of recovery from Hurricane Andrew, service that is especially appreciated and honored as the United States and our territories in the Caribbean recover from Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Jose, and Hurricane Irma. And finally, I applaud your service as president of a major university in our country. You and our president are privileged to have had the opportunity to serve at great institutions of higher education. For all these reasons, Damon College is pleased to provide you with this plaque that acknowledges and honors your service to our nation. Thank you, Secretary Card, for your service, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you, and I apologize for talking so long.
Thank you, sir.